My name is Jose Santiago. I am Scientific Leadership Manager for Abbott Diagnostics, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here this morning. So principles of business intelligence and data analytics as a discipline have been applied to several industries, from aviation to transportation and even online retail. Yet we're beginning to tap into and fully realize the potential of BI applications in healthcare, and in particular in the clinical laboratory space. Mobilizing data to uncover meaningful and valuable insights that can enable better strategic and operational decisions will be the focal point of our workshop this morning. We're very pleased and very honored to have two great speakers, Dr. Brian Jackson and Dr. Tim Skelton, with us this morning. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker for the morning, Dr. Brian Jackson. Dr. Jackson is Vice President and Chief Medical Informatics Officer and Medical Director of Referral Testing and the Informatics Department at ARUP Laboratories. He's also an Associate Professor of Pathology at the University of Utah School of Medicine. Dr. Jackson received his BA degree in mathematics from the University of Utah, followed by an MS in medical informatics and an MD degree also from the University of Utah. He then went on to do a clinical pathology resident at Dartmouth Hitchcock Medical Center in New Hampshire. Throughout his career, Dr. Jackson has combined his medical and mathematics training and expertise to improve informatics applications in the laboratory space and laboratory medicine. Dr. Jackson's research interests include variation in use in laboratory tests, impact of inappropriate testing, and cost-effectiveness analysis of laboratory testing. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Brian Jackson.
All right, good morning. Actually, it's this one. Good morning, happy to be with you today. Hopefully my voice volume is good. Okay, business intelligence for lab operations, principles and pitfalls. Sorry, I'm looking to the right because the image isn't on the screen, but I actually am paying attention to everyone on the left side of the room in my brain. Standard slide, speaker program sponsored by and on behalf of Abbott, and the content of the presentation is consistent and has been reviewed by all of their compliance people. Let me start off with just a few words about where I'm coming from, just so you understand sort of the perspective of how I'm coming at this. I've been at ARUP Laboratories for about 13 years. I'm guessing many of you are familiar at least some level with our organization. We are a not-for-profit entity of the University of Utah. We have one testing location in Salt Lake City, about 3,000 employees, over 10 million specimens a year, which corresponds to over 6.5 million patients whose specimens are coming through a year, and over 100 medical directors and consultants. So the reference lab industry, I think I'm not saying anything new if I say that it's a pretty brutally competitive market sector. You've got some really big players in this space who have been at it a long time, who've gotten very efficient, able to keep costs down. It's not a walk in the park. And then when you're dealing with a test menu of over 3,000 individual assays, 24/7 operations, the vast majority performed on site, performance becomes a very challenging issue, and it's critical to have a comprehensive business intelligence system to keep everything under control and to know, when something's not going well, and having a scorecard. Also having an ability to create incentives for your managers. So here's some sort of basic principles to think through. Why do we need metrics and dashboards? Well, at the simplest level, you need to be measuring things to know if you're doing the right stuff. More importantly, you need metrics to know how well you're doing that stuff on a, ideally quantitative scale. And how are you going to use this is bottom line to make decisions. If you're just measuring stuff to say, hey, that's nice, and then you move on and make all of your decisions based on intuition, then you're not really closing the loop. But most organizations are pretty numbers-based. But here's the kicker. You can come up with any metrics program in the world, and if it looks credible on the surface, your folks are going to start making decisions based on that system, whether the metrics are a good balanced set or not, whether they're biased or not. So coming up with the wrong metric system will give you all the reassurance that you think you're doing a great job managing your lab, but you may be making terrible decisions that are going to damage your competitiveness in the long run. So getting the system set up right is what I want to talk about today. Okay, number one sin in measurement, in business measurement, is this. It's the looking under the lamppost thing. Easiest example that everyone can relate to is that finance metrics are right under the lamppost. Every modern organization has a finance department because you have to do the accounting, because you have to, for tax reasons and everything else. So it's very, very common, not just in healthcare settings, but in industries outside healthcare, for the financial metrics to take precedence, to have much more weight than all of the other measurements because they're there, and because they're available, and because they have some internal reliability so that you know that you can trust the numbers. But again, if you make your corporate decisions based on the things that are more easily measurable and paying less attention to the things that are less easily measurable, then you get big biases, and you don't see the trade-offs where they occur, and you're going to make bad decisions. So let me illustrate. This is very abstract, but let me illustrate. Bad metrics, number one. I'm getting a lot of feedback where I'm sitting. Is it sounding okay out there? You okay? Okay, may just be me. Okay. Bad metrics example number one. This is a pretty classic one. So many of your organizations, I'm assuming, have a purchasing department that is responsible for purchasing reagents and instruments and so forth. One of the jobs of a purchasing department is to negotiate prices. Okay, all well and good. So a lot of CFOs will incentivize purchasing agents and say, if you can negotiate lower prices, we'll give you a bonus. We'll reward you for negotiating lower prices. All of that sounds good. And all of that, in principle, can be a healthy thing for a laboratory to do. The problem comes if you don't set up the numbers right, because the easiest way to set this up is to pay attention to per unit costs. So you've got a purchasing department that can lower the per unit costs on a particular category of reagents by 5%. Why don't you return 2 of that percentage to the agent as a form of an annual bonus? Sounds great. You're incentivizing cost control. The unintended consequence is that one of the easiest ways to negotiate lower reagent prices with your vendors is to negotiate larger batches, larger sort of lock-in periods, basically things that reduce the flexibility of a laboratory that could lead to higher inventory costs, more outdating, and in some cases, potentially even higher overall reagent costs, even though the per unit cost is lower. Bottom line, if the metrics set up right in a way that's aligned with the company's goals, then putting incentives on it makes a lot of sense. But if it's just a little bit off, it can really screw up your organization. Okay, second example. This one I think is going to be really familiar to most of the hospital folks in the room. Measuring labor cost. So labor is a really large portion of laboratory testing in most settings. So it makes complete sense to measure the labor portion of your testing and try to make that as efficient as possible. Okay, great. Where can that go wrong? Well, where it can go wrong is that financial systems in a hospital tend to be set up by department. So the labor for phlebotomists may be all rolling up into a lab budget that has the responsibility of one hospital administrator. But labor costs associated with, say, nursing are probably going to roll up into a different top-level hospital budget that reports to, say, the chief of nursing, a different hospital administrator. So it astounds me that this is as common as it is, but when a hospital gets into a financial crunch, one of the first things that often gets looked at is, hey, let's cut the lab costs. And one of the easiest way to cut the lab costs is let's cut back on phlebotomists. You know, we've got other people that can do that work. Let's just cut the phlebotomist charges. What it does is it makes the hospital administrator responsible for lab costs look really good because you've just offloaded a whole bunch of expensive FTEs. From the system perspective, it's insane. From a system perspective, you took labor that's still going to have to get done, but you've transferred it from specialists who are quite efficient and reliable at what they do to generalist nurses who are in a more chaotic environment and are going to be really stretched to provide the same quality outcome. Plus, the nurses are higher paid. I mean, it's just absolutely insane that a hospital would do this. And yet, if I asked for a raise of hands, anyone who's seen a hospital get rid of phlebotomists, let's just try it. Anyone been in a hospital that's laid off phlebotomists for cost reasons? Yeah, it's insane. But it's a metrics problem. It's a metrics problem because if labor costs were truly being measured correctly at the system level, it wouldn't even occur to anyone to try this sort of a game. Okay, so how do we do a better job with this? How can we align our departmental and overall system goals in a way that's going to work for us? There are really two take-home messages here that I'd like you to walk away with. The first one is the importance of measuring all relevant dimensions in a balanced way. So costs are always going to be one of those dimensions, but if costs are taking an outsized, getting outsized attention, then you get into trouble. So costs need to be balanced by customer impact measurements, and then all of the different quality measurements. In the laboratory space, we'll talk about these a little bit more. So, customer quality, some organizations will go even further and bring in sort of employee development type metrics, which is good as well. But you've got to have a balanced set is the bottom line. Second principle is the importance of rolling up the departmental level metrics up into the corporate level metrics. So it's essentially a granularity problem. The people at the top of the organization want an executive summary of the health of the lab, and that's important. And the people on the front line, if you're, say, a lab supervisor, then you need metrics of how well your individual lab is going. The trick is tying those two set of metrics together so that you're actually accomplishing the same thing. If you incentivize the frontline department to focus more on one thing, but the top-level metrics are more encouraging another thing, then you're not pulling in the same direction. Okay, let's show an example of how this can work in practice. And I'm going to start with a non-healthcare setting because I think it's a little easier to start here in a conceptual sense. And then in the next slide, I'll take this over to a healthcare setting. Okay, so if you're managing a factory or manufacturing plant, this is really highly simplified. But to illustrate the balanced piece, you're going to have different categories of measures that at a bare minimum are going to include your inputs, your outputs, and the quality. Sounds straightforward. Inputs can mostly be measured in terms of costs. Again, if you want to really take this further, you ought to be looking at recruitment pipelines and leadership pipelines and things because your workforce is an important input as well, but I'm keeping this simple. So costs are really important in any system. But the immediate balance on that is the outcome, which in a manufacturing world is usually going to be measured in revenue. So you've got costs, you've got revenue. The difference between the two of them is profit. That's great. If that's all you have, then it's sort of like if you're running a baseball team where your only measures are the actual game scorecards. You're not going to improve very much. You may know how you're doing in the current game, but you're not going to be able to improve much game by game unless you set up some internal quality measures like batting and fielding. And I'm not actually a baseball guy, but you get the idea. So the internal quality measures are really the ones that put you in a position to improve over time. And every one of these can be rolled up from individual frontline kinds of things that frontline managers would use up to the top. Okay, that's the basic principle. How can we translate this into healthcare setting, into managing diagnostics? The first thing that I'm going to assert, costs remain important. I'm going to assert that in most laboratory settings, looking at revenue is really counterproductive because it just is not a good measure, a reflective measure of success. So the exception here would be if you're a pure independent reference lab. And if you're a pure independent reference lab and you want to know how are you competing against others, then yeah, monitoring your revenue is one useful scorecard. If you're a hospital lab or hospital system, then any revenue that goes through the lab is simply an artifact of our really screwy fee-for-service billing system. And it does not it really does not reflect the success of the laboratory. So getting rid of revenue and margin, if you're a hospital setting lab, is I would say step number one. What you replace it with, though, it gets a little bit hard, because what you really want to replace it with is some measure of patient benefit. And that, we're talking outcomes, and that's it's a really immature science right now. But the quality measures are the area where I think we can make the most traction in the short run. Now, I know labs do a lot with quality measurement. I'm just going to make a few comments about where I think some more opportunities are. And again, we need to figure out how to take the top-level roll-up measures and the front-line, individual lab measures and make sure they connect properly. Okay. Where do clinical laboratories have the best measurement systems today in general? On the cost side, most laboratories have a pretty good sense of top-level costs, because you have to. You know how much you're paying a year in reagents. You know how much you're paying a year in labor and other sort of major overhead. You can add it all up. You know your total cost of operations. Okay, great. That's one useful piece of information. Drilling that down into cost per test and cost per patient, yeah, that usually doesn't get done very well. So at the cost level, labs have really great executive roll-up measures. At the quality level, most labs have pretty well-developed systems around sort of instrument quality control and paying attention to at least some turnaround times. But tying those up into more executive measures is often absent. So I guess the good news here is we do have something we can start with, but there's a lot left to go. And then patient benefit, as I said, outcomes are notoriously hard to measure. So these are the opportunities. Okay, just a few words. Costs. Again, total cost of laboratory operations is something that most labs are quite good at keeping track of. Your total labor, your total reagents, total instruments. You've got the invoices. You can add them up on an annual basis, get audited. And there'll be someone in the hospital maybe will have figured out, like facility overhead rates if you're using the hospital's space for your lab. Okay, so that's the easy part. Cost per test gets a lot harder. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands of how many of you rely on your hospital charge master if you ever want to estimate cost per test, but hopefully you know by now that hospital charge masters are notoriously orders of magnitude off in multiple directions. So they really have almost no bearing on actual underlying costs. Third-party fee schedules, same deal. It's sort of convenient when we want to communicate cost of lab tests to just take the local Medicare fee schedule for those labs. But it really doesn't reflect, it's a highly inaccurate estimate of the costs in your particular laboratory. So to do the costing well, you really need to dig in and look at the amount of labor on a shift, how many tests get performed on that shift, how many reagents, how many quality controls, how many everything else, and just do the hard work at an individual test level. I was telling a story last night of where why this is important. I'll keep this sort of short, but about 15 years ago, before I joined ARUP, I heard this story that the Department of Internal Medicine at the University of Utah had a proposal to hospital administration saying, hey, if we could get our internists to not order so many lab tests, will you split the savings with us? And hospital administration said, sure, we don't have to do any of the work, we get some of the savings, it's a slam dunk, it's win-win. So one of the leaders in internal medicine went and got a spreadsheet to see what are the most expensive lab tests, or where are we spending the most money on lab tests at the university. Turned out that serum magnesium showed up way at the top of the list. We looked at that and said, hey, this is a great opportunity. We don't need a serum magnesium every time we order electrolytes. We could order a lot more selectively. So we did an educational campaign, got the internists to be much more selective about their magnesiums, and on paper achieved either a $1 or $2 million apparent savings and promptly got a big kickback annually from the hospital for all of that hard work. The problem here is magnesiums are virtually free in the lab. So it was completely paper savings. The culprit here was our own laboratory organization, because at that point in time we had not done a proper sort of test-by-test costing exercise. I'm not sure where that $80 per magnesium cost had originally come from, but it probably was an artifact of decades of using charge masters for years before. So it's just, you can get really screwed up decision making if you don't know your cost properly. It's the bottom line. Okay, cost per case. Cost per case, this is where it really gets difficult. And I'd be actually curious if any of you in the audience feel like you have a reasonable estimation of cost per case for any of your laboratory tests. People have done that. But really, this is where the rubber hits the road. To get cost per case, you've got to know how many tests are being ordered per type of diagnosis or type of workup. And labs traditionally don't have visibility into those kinds of data. But yet, if you're going to really save money over the long haul, it's not just the cost of the test, it's how often the test is being used. So cost per case gets really important. I don't know how many of you have seen this article. It's from 2011, so it's about 5 years old now, 6 years old now. Michael Porter's a Harvard Business School strategy guru, and teamed up with another sort of big name guy named Robert Kaplan, who's made his career on balanced scorecards. And their thesis, I think, is a little over the top, but they basically said that activity-based costing is what's going to save healthcare. I think that's, again, a little overstated, but on the other hand, there are significant opportunities when you go through, do the costing properly at a hospital system level, not just the lab level, to know how much things really cost, not what you think they cost, and then you can manage things much more smartly. Can you imagine, so we're in San Diego, so we're very close to the shipping industry here on the coast of San Diego. So if you're a shipbuilder and you're under contract to build a ship for the Navy, if you don't know how much each of those parts costs, how much it costs to add another cannon on the deck, or add I don't know what are all the parts on a Navy ship. There are lots of parts. If you don't know how much each of those parts actually costs you, do you think you're going to be able to bid properly on this job and make money? It would be ridiculous. But yeah, in healthcare, we do this all the time. We just run ahead without knowing what things cost. Okay, benefits. Again, this is the column where I'm asserting that the outcome measurement in a hospital or clinic setting should not be revenue. Revenue is just a bizarre artifact of the billing system. It does not give you an accurate sense of your success. We need to figure out patient outcome measures related to diagnostics, and that's hard. And I'm just going to confess, I don't have the answers today. So I'll just put this as a placeholder. Maybe next year we can come up with something for this. But the point I will make here, though, is that anything about measuring patient benefit is not going to be defined within the walls of the laboratory. So any patient outcome measures really need to be defined at the institutional level with a global, holistic clinical perspective, and then figure out where diagnostics fit into that to provide measurable benefits. Okay, quality measurement. Again, in an ideal world, we do a lot of quality measurement in the laboratory at the individual assay level. How do we roll that up into more of a health system perspective? So a couple ideas. First of all, what not to do. A lot of hospitals, let's just say, paying for value rather than paying for volume is extremely popular. I've been talking about it for years. Everyone wants to pay for value. Congress for years has been trying to tweak Medicare reimbursement schemes to be pay more attention to value rather than volume. Haven't gotten very far, but everyone wants to go in this direction. What are these kinds of reimbursement schemes using to measure that value? Well, things like the CMS ACO criteria. So a couple of years ago, I sat down. These numbers are a little bit dated, so if you notice that they're not the right numbers, it's because I did it a couple of years ago. But I sat down, I looked at HEDIS scoring, looked at the CMS ACO quality measures. Just for completeness, I looked at the Choosing Wisely measures, even though they're not really technically a quality measurement system, they're more of an educational system, but anyway, I just wanted to put them side by side. The total numbers of measures of these kinds of systems are typically order of magnitude, 100-ish, plus or minus. You might find a measurement system that might have a couple hundred measures in it. How many of those are measuring diagnostic processes? Usually a relatively small fraction. How many of those diagnostic processes are actually laboratory processes? It's going to be even a smaller number. So do you think that the CMS ACO criteria with 4 measures that even have anything to do with the laboratory at all, do you think it's going to be a useful, holistic measurement of the quality of laboratory testing in that setting? No. No, it's laughable. It's completely laughable. In fact, any external, nationally driven system is going to suffer from the same problem because I don't mean to sound so critical of these systems. They play a role, but the role they do not play is to replace a hospital's own quality management system. And so when hospital administrators say, okay, our quality management system is based on all these external measures, then your hospital administrators have basically abdicated their responsibility and turned it over to something that's just not going to work because it's not going to be representative. So if that's not the approach, what is the approach? So a couple of things to think about. Measuring overall reliability of the diagnostic process does require stepping out of the laboratory space and looking at how the tests are getting used in the clinical space. So are the right tests being ordered? How many of the wrong tests are being ordered? Looking at frequencies, looking at efficiency, looking at misses. Where are there protocols in place? Where are there things that can be tightened up? And I'm going to assert that turnaround times are an underappreciated area here. I think every lab measures key turnaround times, but I think if we're really going to comprehensively improve diagnostic process in our hospitals, I think we need to get a lot more serious about turnaround time measurement systems that extend into the clinical space, not just measuring lab turnaround times. On the variation side, variation is not a quality measure per se, but it's something that can give a lot of useful insights into where quality measures might be developed. So it's more of an adjunct kind of a thing, but there's a lot of success over the last 40 years in healthcare in measuring variation, variation across departments, variation across hospitals. A good example of this, I think a lot of you are familiar with work in transfusion medicine, where if you publish, essentially de-identified scorecards of how many units of red cells different surgeons used, not only do they usually not get offended, but over time, the high utilizers tend to come way down to the mean. So again, is a quality measure per se, it's related to quality. I don't know the term to use. But if you're going to do variation measurement, again, you got to make sure you go back to the raw source, because if you start with your billing data, it just totally screws up your measurements. Turnaround time, I'm not going to say a lot here, but other than say that in my observation, a lot of labs preferentially pay attention to the portion of turnaround time they have control over. So an ED turnaround time is often measured as, you know, the time you receive the specimen to the time you release the result. Well, what if it took 4 hours to draw the specimen? Yeah, the lab ignores that. So really, if we want to use turnaround time for real clinical process improvement, we really need to go sort of end to end, and that requires a lot more collaboration with the clinical units. So again, just to recap, I think labs do a lot of measurement, but I think our best measurements are in things like total costs and test level quality, and there's a lot of opportunity to be creative and collaborative and figure out how we can turn these into much more comprehensive scorecards. So my closing slide is to emphasize that laboratory medicine is really about medicine. So anyway, thank you very much. I'm going to stick around after the next talk, and then any questions we can take at that point.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jackson. And while I introduce Dr. Skelton, we're going to do a little bit of technical fixing over here in the computer, so please pardon our dust, if you will. So our next speaker is Dr. Tim Skelton. Dr. Skelton is currently the medical director of the core laboratory and laboratory informatics in the Department of Laboratory Medicine at Leahy Hospital and Medical Center in Burlington, Massachusetts. He's a board-certified clinical pathologist who received his BS from MIT and an MD PhD degrees from Washington University in St. Louis. He then did a residency and fellowship training at Massachusetts General Hospital. Dr. Skelton is a leader in the implementation of new approaches to the clinical practice of laboratory medicine that impacts the economics and outcomes of patient care. He has combined his NIH-funded research, industry collaborations, and advanced informatics technology to develop lab-based algorithms that maximize an integrated healthcare system's ability to deliver high-quality, low-cost patient care. So please help me welcome Dr. Tim Skelton.
Thank you, Jose. Yeah. Can you hear me? Yep. I want to thank the Informatics group and the Abbott scientific group for giving me the opportunity to come and share what we're learning at Leahy Health in terms of how we're going to use data to make better operational decisions. That's what we're doing. And you know, the first word in my slide is learning. I don't see it up there. Yeah, I really want to emphasize that what I'm going to share is what we're learning. I mean, we're still really at the beginning of this. It's very exciting. What I've found so far is really working well, but you know, we're in the process of figuring this stuff out. So I'm hoping that I can share with you some of the things we found, some of the insights that we've come up with, and that you know, you all can go back to your institutions and start using it in your own institutions. So that's really my goal. The opinions I'm expressing here are my own opinions. You know, it doesn't represent Leahy or Abbott. And what I want to talk about is first is that one of the things we're doing is we're forming a health system. So we've really got Leahy Health is the merger of 3 hospital systems. We've got a Burlington Hospital, which is the big academic medical center, and then we have 4 community hospitals. Peabody's traditionally been associated with Burlington. We've got Winchester Hospital, which has this Woburn offsite laboratory, which has had a very successful outreach program. So they've really done a lot of good work in making a lot of money in competing with Quest in our area and having an outreach program. And then there's Beverly Hospital and Addison Gilbert Hospital, which are on Roche chemistry. At Burlington and Peabody, we were on Beckman-Coulter chemistry. And so as a system, we're trying to figure out how to standardize our testing to save money and eliminate duplications. So we decided to go with Abbott for standardizing chemistry. particularly because we like the way their integrated analyzers work. So when you integrate chemistry and immunochemistry, you can put all of your tests on one mint green lithium heparin gel separator tube and put it on this analyzer and do all of your immunoassays and chemistries. So it eliminates the need for all these automation systems that do aliquoting and routing of specimens in complex ways. So it simplifies it so much that you can now just use this little work cell that can be scalable to whatever size the laboratory is and have a standardized IT system. The Epic Beaker is our LIS. We got rid of all the traditional LISs. And then we use data innovations as the middleware to really drive the workflow. And the technologists work in the workspace of data innovations to figure out what they need to do. And so we do a lot of sort of intra-laboratory decision support to really optimize what the laboratory does. And so once we get this really efficient, optimized work cell that's really cheaper and more highly productive and gives you better service than you get from any other systems that are out there, it's easily portable. So as our health system's expanding, we can just plug in other hospitals into this. We don't have to redesign the courier service and fight over which lab is going to have the central lab that all the specimens go to. So we really thought this was a great strategy to expand. And so we really focused just on the informatics and really making this work cell so efficient that all the other hospitals that join us would just want to do that. So we're in the process of setting that up. And I think one of the key concepts we came up with is that you need redundancy, right? So at every hospital, you need 2 of these analyzers. And some hospitals that's really more capacity than you need. But you need it to do the stat testing, and you can't have one analyzer down and have all these backup handheld devices as a backup, or courier specimens in a stat way to the main hospital. So once you have this set up and you have these 2 analyzers, you have enough throughput capacity to do all of the testing that's performed at that site. So you can, instead of having some of your stat tests or a few of the tests done and just make your acute care hospital into a stat lab and then send it off to some production lab, in our case it would have been this core lab that's an off-site lab. Now you need 2 tubes, and you need couriers, and someone has to package the tube, and someone has to receive the tube, and you can't add on while it's in the courier on the way to the other facility. So we found that was really inefficient, and so you've got all the capacity so we've got 5 acute care laboratories where patients are being taken care of. So our strategy was, whatever gets drawn there, you run it there. You put it all on one tube, you put it on one analyzer, the whole test menu's on that analyzer, and you're done. And these analyzers are mirrored image. So we've got 3 of these CI8200s, and they're mirror images of each other, so it doesn't matter which tube you put it on. So you don't need a track or some kind of complex routing or sorting. So you basically eliminate all the things you need for these really expensive automation tracks, and you've got this nice, efficient, simple work cell that you really want to invest in and optimize. And of course, the bigger your health system is, the more money you can put into really optimizing every aspect of that work cell. So we're in the process right now of trying to do that, and we're using business intelligence to figure out what is really the best optimum way of doing it. So I think the key thing is that this informatics is the hub of this strategy. And you standardize into a single enterprise electronic health record, which is Epic, and it's a relational database containing all the patient data for analytics. And so basically all the clinical data, all the laboratory data, you basically want to build your Epic system to put that into discrete data elements. If someone needs to know where that discrete data element is, and I think this is a key role at every institution for laboratory clinical informatics, is to know the architecture of your build at your institution. So you know where that data is, and then you can extract it. So you need to make sure that when the SQL analyst is extracting that data, that you're getting the right data elements. There's probably 10 different specimen IDs that you could pick, and only a laboratorian would really know which is the right specimen ID. Or, source. What do they pick when they do this extract for source? It could be, ordering location, ordering physician's department. It could be collection location. It could be, patient location at the time of accessioning. There's a lot of different locations you could pick, and you got to make sure you pick the right one. And you need a laboratory professional to figure that out. So there's, I think, a really critical role in the future for laboratory physicians who really get into informatics and laboratory technologists and informatics specialists at companies that serve laboratories. So I'm very excited by this. Of course, what we've done, we replaced the traditional LIS with Epic Beaker, so there's no interface. So you get rid of all those interface problems. We have a enterprise Abbott Instrument Manager, which is the Data Innovations Instrument Manager. We got the newest version with all of its current up-to-date features, and that forces us to standardize all the core lab processes throughout the health system, because there's one configuration with one set of rules, and so each hospital can't do their own thing. And this is a major, change management problem, because laboratory managers are used to having absolute autonomy over their laboratory. And they take great pride in it, and they take full responsibility for it. But when you form a health system, you can't do that anymore, because the system gets way too complicated. And when something goes wrong, no one knows how to support it, no one knows how to fix it. So to have a functional laboratory system for a health system, you have to standardize. So standardization is really key. And I think using this approach where you have the same set of rules forces that, because you only have one configuration. You don't allow each manager to do their own thing. And there's huge cost savings and clinical benefits in doing that. And then you've got economy of scale where you can really optimize based on clinical tolerances. You can optimize all the things you do in the laboratory on the ultimate clinical outcome, the impact on clinical care. And the other thing we have is we actually have another instance of data innovations, which is between the chemistry Abbott Instrument Manager and Beaker, and all the other systems interface through that. Now, the technologies don't work in that. That's just a data conversion thing to allow interfacing of, we actually have 374 Beaker methods. Those are like instruments, all that go through this Data Innovations Manager. And so there's an inter-IM connection that goes between these two. But so the difference between the Abbott Instrument Manager is the technologists live in there, and that is the workspace and the interface of the technologist and the computer. Where if you just interface directly through the Epic instance of Data Innovations, it's just an interface, and the technologists then work in Beaker or they work in the instrument screen. So that's the setup. And I think when you look at this, you've got to think of what the primary role of the laboratory is. And it's basically an information processing and distribution machine that alters the treatment, diagnosis, outcome, and throughput of patients. It really impacts the workflow efficiency of providers and can actually impact the quality-based performance measurements and payments that the hospital are getting for revenue. So I think if you look at this as our mission, the informatics becomes critically important. And the role is not to reduce the lab budget to the lowest cost per test, but the goal is to change healthcare clinical processes downstream of the laboratory in a way that really helps you get to value-based healthcare. So every operational decision you make in the laboratory, you need to think about both the cost and the quality impact downstream of the laboratory. And so that's value-based healthcare. And of course, the traditional approach is that the administrators worry about cost and the CMO and various safety committees worry about quality, and they're always fighting with each other to try to move up or down the cost-quality curve. And I think what clinical informatics gives you are win-win situations where you actually move the quality-cost curve. So you can make changes in the laboratory that impact downstream clinical workflows and patient flows and provider activities and patient outcomes that actually cost the institution less money and increase the quality of care for the patients. And of course, I'm excited about the laboratory's role and piece in this clinical informatics, because we're really well suited from our backgrounds really drive it for the institution. So I think the value proposition for laboratory informatics that you want to deliver to the C-suite at your institution is that they should invest in laboratory decision support and business intelligence as a lever to change clinical practice in a direction that positively impacts the system's operating margin. So you can actually pay for this by helping the hospital's operating margin. The other thing we can do is use laboratory informatics tools as a mechanism to change clinical practice in a direction that reduces total healthcare costs. Those two things aren't the same, so you can do things that help your operating margin, or you can do things that really help reduce healthcare costs. A lot of times reducing total healthcare costs helps the insurance companies. But one of the strategies we're doing, so we're in the process of, Leahy Health is about $2 billion of revenue and 1,500 physicians. We're actually right now signed an agreement where we're tripling the size of our health system. We're merging with Beth Israel Deaconess and Mount Auburn Hospital, and there's 13 hospital systems that are merging. And we're really going to try to compete with partners, which is Mass General and Brigham and Women's Hospital in the Boston area. And one of the key strategies of this new health system is that we provide lower cost care, or higher value care, but particularly lower cost care. So from a system point of view, in order to compete with the other health system in our Boston area, is that we do want to lower the total healthcare cost, because then employers are going to direct their employees to come to us for health care because they'll have to pay less for their insurance. We'll be a lower tier provider on their insurance when the employee has to pick where they're going to get their health care. The employees will still have choices, but the idea is that employers and insurance plans will direct patients to higher quality, lower cost systems, and that the patients will decide because they have to pay, they get lower co-pays or lower annual fees to make that choice. So part of the strategy is to reduce total healthcare costs, and clearly laboratory informatics has just an endless supply of ways in which we can help the institution accomplish that. The problem is, though, that sometimes when you reduce total healthcare costs, you're also reducing revenue, and you may be impacting the operating margin in a negative way. So you got to kind of balance those two. We know how to use troponin to let patients go after a couple hours in the emergency room, go home. But now all of a sudden we've got all this excess capacity of cardiologists and interventions that we do. Observation units. If you really use troponin right, we can just shut down the observation unit in the hospital. So you've got it, now they're losing revenue for all these cardiologists and for the operation. And so short term, that can really get resistant. But in the long term, it can actually help our system compete with other systems because lower total health care costs. So what this does is if you focus on balance these two and make the right decisions, you can actually help the institution change from a fee-for-service to a value-based healthcare system in a way that's financially sustainable, that won't put the hospital into financial trouble. And I think the key thing is that laboratory professionals can be redeployed to be involved in these informatics activities. And so that's one big insight that we've really learned, is we have not been very successful at bringing in computer analysts and having them work on laboratory projects, because it's very difficult to someone who doesn't have history to understand why there's 10 specimen IDs, or what the difference between a container and a specimen and things like that. So, and you can't really communicate with them. So what we found very successful is to take laboratory technologists who are good at computers and train them in this business informatics. And so there was actually one point right before we were going live on Epic, one of the technologists came to me and said, who is going to interface all of our instruments to Beaker? Because Epic didn't really worry about it. It was like a data innovations thing, and they forgot all about it. And what most hospitals do is they just keep their traditional LAS, which is, I think, a mistake, because then you have to have a whole nother go live when you get rid of your traditional LAS. So we decided, based on what other institutions had told us, to just go with Beaker, but Epic didn't have any experience interfacing these 374 instruments to Beaker. And so this technologist came to me and said, what are we going to do? Who's going to interface all these instruments? And I said, you are. Because she was obviously the right person to do it, because she understood there was a gap and that nobody was doing it and it needed to be done. And so she did. Eventually, a little shock initially, but then she learned how to do it, and she actually did for about 2.5 years interface all these instruments. And now she's actually part of the Beaker team, and she works for IT. So our Beaker team is got 5 ex-med techs who now work in the IT department, and that's really a great strategy because they understand the laboratory. And of course, then we got to hire new med techs and replace them, and get the med techs who work in operations are learning to use the data innovations middleware, the Abbott Instrument Manager, and the IQ business intelligence, and so now we're training more medical technologists. So I really think the source of the people to do this are laboratory professionals. But then, of course, as you use these tools, operations gets more efficient, and you don't need as many technologists moving specimens around or pipetting samples and things like that, making buffers. So I think we're really in a change process that's changing what laboratory professionals do, what the role of the laboratory is in these big integrated healthcare systems. And the best way to embrace this is to train medical technologists to understand this computer stuff and use these business intelligence tools. So here's just an example. I'll give you an example how we use this. So on June 28th this year, we put in a new automated dilution process for testosterone. So yeah, I'll go back. Okay, there we go. Such that an undiluted repeat was automatically performed for testosterone less than 13. So instead of the techs doing this stuff manually, we had the instrument manager drive this and the instrument drive this. And so we went live with it. We're working with our ITS from Abbott to figure out what best practices are with the 8.14 version of Instrument Manager, with no traditional LAS, with Beaker. We've got the latest version of Beaker, which is 2017. So there is no other institution that has all of these tools. And so we're really inventing things, we're learning. So we tried this, and what happened was that it had the benefit of reducing manual steps for the technologists, so their labor savings. But the problem is it held the containers on these integrated analyzers, standalone analyzers, for a longer time. And prostate cancer patients who have metastatic prostate cancer get testosterone PSA measured as soon as they arrive for an outpatient visit. And they're going to get chemotherapy, but the providers don't want to give the chemotherapy if it's not working because it's a toxic drug. So they look at the PSA to see if it's dropping or stable, then they'll give the chemotherapy. But if the PSA is rising, they know the chemotherapy is not working, and they'll withhold that chemotherapy. So they need to have these results at that visit. But now, of course, they're all on hormone suppression therapy, so they have a low testosterone. So we implemented this automated process, and it held the PSA results too long, and then the patients are waiting there. The doctor's ready to infuse the chemotherapy, and they're waiting for the PSA result to come back. And so it was delaying this stat PSA result, disrupted the workflow in the hem-onc infusion clinic. It was a patient dissatisfier. And so we needed to address this. So we used the business intelligence to identify immediately what was happening. So we had this monitor, and in this example, this is the IQ BIS. We're looking at our PSA diagnostic tests specifically, and we're looking at the turnaround time from last received lab until result. And our goal is to have 95% of the samples done within an hour when it comes from the hem-onc and infusion areas. So what I did is I set this up as a favorite in the BIS, so it's only looking at these PSA diagnostic tests, and you can see that in this example, we're only meeting the turnaround time 70% of the time, and we're not up to 95% of the time until 4 hours. And this is what was happening before we went live, and then it also shows you, the time it takes, the percent that reached the goal, and you can look at 2 different time periods and say, what happened before and what happened after, and you can see the change. And you can actually drill down to the day, so this is a given day, and you can see we went live here, so we were running at 70 to 95% turnaround time, and then the day we went live with this new process, we dropped way off. So it's real-time data, so laboratorians are good at this and looking at analyzers. You look at daily quality control. As the quality control is in, you have a stable operating system. When the quality control are out of range, you've got a system problem, and you stop and you look at your system and fix it. Well, this is sort of the same thing, but from a clinical point of view. You want monitoring in real time and statistically, and then you see this significant drop. So we're going to continue to monitor this on BIS. Here's another good example of a graph you see, which is a cumulative graph showing the time and then the resulted and your goal. So you can monitor this dashboard in real time. And I think the key to these things is having a service level agreement between the medical directors of the clinical service and the laboratory. So the medical directors get together and you say, okay, what level of service do we need to come up with in order to maintain the requirements for patient care? And so I met with the head of the HEMONC division, and we came up with, if we get 95% of the patient results done in an hour, it won't impact the patient flow. Doctors will be able to give their workflow will become much more efficient. They'll be able to give the chemotherapy appropriately. So we basically set up, and you can do this with any test in your lab. You basically set up a target, was 1 hour, and a goal was 95%. But I think it's key to have a written service level agreement so that if someone else tries to change something, you'll immediately see that you're not meeting the service level agreement, and then you've got to fix it so that you can get back to meeting your service level. And of course, these clinicians will back us up. Some administrator cuts FTEs or ships specimens somewhere where we think it's not good. We can immediately show the impact on quality, get the clinicians to back us up, show the written service level agreement, and say this isn't acceptable, and then get back. And then of course, financially, it's not acceptable because you're really making things less efficient for the providers. So this is a great example of how we use this. Now, some caveats is you always got to validate this data. So you can get data from 3 different sources, and they'll tell you a different story. And then you've got to figure out why, one system tells you you're getting 95% turnaround time, another one says you're getting 70%. So you want to use your instrument manager data, you want to use your billing, accounting data, you want to use Epic data, business intelligence data, and make sure that they agree with each other. And I think that's a step most people are missing. They get some data, usually you hire some consultant, they have some data that tells the story they want to tell, and of course the consultants always find what the person who hired them wanted them to find, and this is a great tool to kind of push back against that system and say, well, no, our data says this, and we validated our data that it's real. So we did try, validate this data. I mean, you can really get down to the details with this business intelligence down to individual instruments. So you can see where this is the Remazole with 2 DXCs attached, where we're reducing the testing we're doing on Beckman, and we're increasing the testing we're doing on the Abbott chemistry analyzers, and you can see how things are going by the day. And here's an example on one day, June 27th. We had 4 of these diagnostic PSAs on this analyzer, 11 on this analyzer, and 1 on this analyzer. So you can really get down to details. But here's how we validated data. So we went into Epic and did a clarity report, which is the relational database, and looked at this key performance indicator. And you can see that on the left is 3 weeks prior to the change. We were at about 90% meeting our turnaround time goal. And then after we did the change and made the labs more efficient, we went down to 75% turnaround. So you can, and then if you get a different answer, you can look at why are they different. Is it because of the source is different, or are you taking from collection time in one system and you're looking at receive time in another system? And this is where the laboratory informatics comes in. You really need a medical technologist good at informatics to take a deep dive in this and really tease out why you get different results from different reports. Until you get comfortable with what you really is you want to test, and you're getting the right data elements into that, then you can trust the data. So you got to validate it. And of course, what we did then is, this was the week before last week on Friday, we said, we figured out with our ITS that the problem we had is that we were collating results off the instrument by module. That's what we're currently doing. So we collate all the chemistries and then release it to the instrument manager. Off the instrument, we collate all our immunoassays and release it. And when we're designing our new system that we're going live with the Enterprise 8.14, we're going to release tests individually from the instrument, and then we're going to have like a 10-minute delay in the driver, and then we run all our instrument manager rules. And we're going to be able to put specimen tags for things like hemolysis and icterus and lipemia, so that even if those tests don't come into instrument manager at the same time, it'll still use the HIL parameters and the calculations. So there are some IT breakthroughs with the new version of Instrument Manager that's really going to let us to run this more efficiently. So in August when we go live, what we're going to do is we're going to release results individually. So as soon as the PSA is done, it's going to go across and be released. The testosterone can stick around longer. They don't need that result to begin the infusion. They just need it at the end of the infusion to make sure their hormone suppression is working. So you need to know what's going on in the heme clinic. So when we turn that on, that'll solve our problem. But we didn't want to wait that long and have disruption in heme for a month. They probably changed their processes to accommodate it. So what we did is we actually had Beaker accession them to different tubes. So the PSA diagnostic went to its own test tube, its own container, and then it gets loaded on the analyzer and it's not held up. Of course, that makes our operations less efficient because we have more containers. So you got to, these cancer patients are getting more blood drawn from them. Someone's got to label those containers, transport them, receive them, load them on the analyzer. So that's kind of wasteful. So I think when we move to collating individually by tests and releasing tests individually and collating in Instrument Manager, we can put them back onto the same test tube again, and then our costs will go down. So I think, as Dr. Jackson pointed out, using volume is not a good way to assess cost in the laboratory. You shouldn't just give resources to the laboratory based on their volume. That doesn't make sense. But one thing that you can do is say, what systems use fewer containers? Because containers are a better measure of cost to the laboratory than test volume. Just running another test on a container really costs nothing. It was like the magnesium example that Dr. Jackson mentioned. So here's our U-shaped work cell, where we basically have, these are the ARC 1, 2, and 3 are the 3 CIA 200s, the pneumatic tube. They come in here, they get received, they get spun in a 3-minute spin, they get put into the racks as they come out of the centrifuge. They're put in a decapper, there's a decapper and recapper here, and then it just gets loaded on the analyzer. It's done, it comes off, it gets recapped and put into storage. So it's so efficient that, it's basically not that different than just loading an automation track, but you don't need all this front-end aliquoting and all the costs with an automation system. So that's kind of key to our plans. And of course, what we're going to do is we use the Epic Beaker to put on the label whether the technology should load the analyzer in the trays. So you got these 25 tube trays that we're going to do everything in there as stat. So everything should be done within 60 minutes. It doesn't matter if it's routine or stat. But then in there's certain tests that have to be done faster than 60 minutes. They get a mark on the label, the container label, and that container gets loaded in the priority lane. You can still combine all your tests into one tube, but if any of the tests on there are tests that have to be done faster than an hour, it goes into the priority lane, and then you can load up these analyzers with routine work, and you won't slow down the stat testing. So it's perfect for our model, right, which is that we're at an acute care facility, and we want to run all of the testing that gets collected at that facility. So often an argument is, well, you want to get the routine work out of the laboratory so you don't slow down your stat work. You want the acute care hospitals to be stat labs and just focus on the stat. That's actually inefficient, and with this setup, we'll be able to do all the routine work, have the tests that need to be done really fast, less than an hour, put into the priority bypass lanes, and there's actually things like HCG and troponin have their own stat probe that'll load the reagent into the tray, and the trays can all be loaded up with routine tests, and you won't slow down the turnaround time. So you can do stat testing and large volume, high throughput routine testing in an acute care hospital. So it kind of solves a lot of the problems that the other systems have. So the other thing, you can use this BIS to look at things like volume shifts by analyzer and test site to guide testing strategies. So here you can see we're shifting from these analyzers over. We've got a new analyzer that went into action that month, and you can see the volume shifting, so you can really keep track of what's going on. And what we did is we looked at the 3 models for Leahy Health and came up with the one that seems to be the best. So one the administrators liked at the beginning was an off-site laboratory. In fact, we had a consultant that came in and told us, this is what we're going to do, and we're going to do an off-site laboratory. And the argument is it's a lower cost real estate, and they had a lot of success with the outreach fee-for-service program. The tertiary medical center fought back and said, no, we want to do it. We want to be the central core lab, and we'll have the greatest impact on specialty care and providers. But what we did is we used the business intelligence to demonstrate that actually neither of those is the best model in terms of cost and turnaround time and number of containers and tests per container. And actually, we came up with this system optimized shared service, which really just looked at what's the best thing for the system, not what works for one lab or the other. And it's much more compatible with a value-based healthcare. And so just to show you, this is the hospital as an outreach client of an offsite lab where all the specimens would go to Woburn. This is what the consultants wanted. They had a lot of bad data, so we used our business intelligence to demonstrate that their data was off, their conclusions were invalid. So we succeeded in getting that consultant, they terminated the relationship with that consultant. I wish they would just said, okay, we'll do what you planned, but what they actually did is they hired another consultant. They said, well, yeah, you're right, that consultant was bad. We'll get a good consultant this time. So now we have another consultant that's looking at our proposal for how we want to run the labs. Because we want to expand this not just for chemistry, but we're going to do this for all core lab testing. And then here's if you use the tertiary medical center as the outreach lab. The problem with these is that they're often justified because the dominant lab that's getting most of the specimens is getting more efficient. So they're saying, oh, see, we're the more efficient lab, so you should send us the work. But as the system as a whole, you actually lose more from the non-dominant labs because they get less efficient in terms of the metrics. So you got to look at the whole system, and I think that's one of the things the business intelligence tools are allowing us to do. You look at your whole network and say, what's the net impact on cost and quality for your whole network? And you'll come up with a very different conclusion than if you were just looking at the volume of testing per FTE at the tertiary medical center. Because then it's an unstable situation. They can say, oh, they have the best, they're the most efficient lab. They have the most tests per FTE or the lowest cost per test. So then they're going to send more specimens to this laboratory because they perceive it as being the most efficient lab. But it's really a false argument because if you look at the whole system, this is less efficient than this model. So this model, basically the core labs testing is all done at the acute care sites where it's collected. And you don't send things off to an off-site laboratory. There are reference testing and specialty type testing that you can do that can be done at one location that you could do there, where turnaround time doesn't matter, you don't need it for acute care. If you could do some of that testing here, and whatever isn't worth doing there, you'd send off to ARUP in Salt Lake City. So the core lab tests, just to define it, because sometimes there's confusion about this terminology, it's tests that are done 24/7, time-sensitive tests that are required for clinical care for the patients. It's high throughput automated instrumentation. It includes things like routine chemistry, immunoassay, hematology, routine coag, urinalysis, blood gas, and osmolality. So all of that should be done in these work cells at the acute care hospital where the samples are being collected. And you don't need a courier, and you don't need a big core lab, a central off-site facility. So here's the specialty testing, the kind of stuff that you might want to do close to a provider that doesn't really apply to core lab. And then there's off-site testing, reference testing, another set of tests that fit that category. So we're moving forward with this using business intelligence software. And the decisions are based on the lowest cost process for both the laboratory and considering downstream clinical services that are impacted by laboratory performance. So I think this is the shared laboratory service, and this is using metrics like patients tested per FTE, or the fewest containers, are the kind of things we're using in this. And one of the challenges, I think, that Dr. Jackson pointed out is that each of these hospitals has their own P&L. So the solution, I think, is that they own that revenue. Wherever the patient is collected, they own the revenue, and then they can share the cost of testing. So then you can really just look at cost and service, downstream effects of testing, and you don't have to really worry about revenue. And I think one of the other key things I want to put is that the real efficiency gains are achieved through systematic optimization of processes. So you're constantly optimizing your process, and I think shifting from the business management flavor of the month to the next is very disruptive, doesn't allow for optimization, and actually wastes a lot of money. And so the key thing from my perspective is that I want to use this business intelligence tools to demonstrate that. So when they make a decision based on the business flavor of the month and they claim these savings, we can show them that it's going to actually make things more disruptive and cost more money. And likewise, if you have intrinsically motivated long-term employees and long-term vendor partnerships that you really stick with, that there's an absence of this disruptive short-term consulting. And again, the business intelligence data can demonstrate those benefits. So one of the key things is doing these SQL extracts. So this is where you need laboratory informatics specialists at your institution who know where the data is, where to find the data. So here's the SQL query that we're using that basically focuses on container, patient, and result component. And we have something like test type is your panel, and then these are your components of the panel. And it's amazing how initially, if you just get computer analysts to go in there, it can be totally off, and they won't recognize it. So you need to, while this is being developed, you need to have laboratory informatics people look at it. And here's an example, too, where the specimen ID wasn't right. So we ran a report, and this specimen ID in the left column, which was a container ID, was actually coming from the Epic Chronicles database. So the Chronicles is the cache database where it's being filled in real time. And you can see there's a master file, which is called OVC, where the container is. Every time a container is made, there's a record, an OVC record. And the item number in there is the specimen ID that the barcode has. So this is really powerful for the lab because the technologist can just want any container, and that's the number that comes up. And what we found is that in the Clarity databases, so every night at midnight, you extract the data out of your cache database into the relational database that you do your SQL queries off of. Every night that gets transferred over, and what we found is that this table, this is your Epic Clarity table where this number was hidden, was actually not even extracted. So as we were doing this BIS project with Abbott, I went in here and found they were using some number off of the specimen table, which didn't have the container ID that's actually on the barcode. So again, the laboratory informatics was required to identify the need to extract the appropriate table, and each hospital system will have a different data architecture depending on how their system was built and how the discrete data was stored in the database. Again, we need laboratory professionals to be informatics specialists. So then we did, of course, it took us a week, but then we went back and extracted this table out of Epic, out of the Chronicles database into the Clarity database, and then we were able to do the proper SQL extract to get it up into the cloud, into the AllinIQ, database that then our business intelligence software queues off of. Again, I think we're going to have to do a similar kind of analysis with our source, because I don't think the source isn't coming out right. And it really takes a laboratory professional to see that. The computer analysts won't. So I think that's the vision for the future. there's a lot more of these dashboards can give you in details, which I won't go into. But here's an example we actually did it. So we moved tests from the tertiary medical center back to the community medical center. So we were running these tests, which we considered not stat, and we said, oh, we'll consolidate it to our big tertiary medical center. What we did is we decided, well, let's try this strategy. So we actually now have these tests performed at the community hospital instead of at the main hospital. So so now you got one tube instead of two tubes. It just gets put on the analyzer and it's done. It's actually a lot more efficient. And then you could use the business intelligence to show that the containers per patient go down and the tests per patient and the tests per sample go up, and we're more efficient. And here's just an example to show you can add the labor analytics to this, where this green line shows you what the patients per FTE are. So you can show that for the whole system, you're actually more efficient by doing that testing at the community site where it's collected instead of sending it to the main hospital. And we struggled for years trying to run our community hospital lab like a stat lab and sending everything to the central lab. It made us feel good, made our metrics look better. It wasn't good for the system, and so now we're changing. We're going the other direction. We're trying to do as much testing as possible at the site it's collected. And there's more. I just want to skip over this for time. But just to look at, so basically we're using these Abbott CI 8200 integrated analyzers, putting everything on one primary tube, loading it on the analyzer, and being done. We really need to optimize the reagent cartridge use so that you have mirror imaging. This is counterintuitive to a lot of managers and technologists because they feel like, oh, we're going to waste reagents on the analyzers that that don't get used as much. But it turns out it's actually a lot more efficient. And if you do it right, you don't really have to waste reagents, and you can do once per day reagent loading, and then you don't need an automation system. That's millions of dollars saved. At the tertiary medical center, again, we need to optimize the testing at the community hospital so they can do more of the testing at that site. A lot of it's based on volume, not on whether it's stat or routine. Okay, so the key thing is it's by the test. You decide this test belongs in the core lab, should be done at the site of collection, rather than, oh, stat testing should be done here and routine testing should be done somewhere else. It doesn't work well. It certainly doesn't work well in Epic and Beaker. Some other LISs might have a way to do it, but it's really not the best way to go. You do it by test. Again, we're pushing these analyzers. I'll just skip over this, but we're trying to push the limit. When we'll know when we're putting too much volume on these tests because the stat testing will be slowed down. And we haven't gotten there. We think we're up at 200,000 tests per month, and we haven't seen a deterioration of quality yet. So I don't think we haven't hit the limit yet of what these analyzers can do. The last thing I want to talk about is turnaround time. There's lots of different ways to measure turnaround time, and I just want to show this one because you can do received to resulted, collected to resulted, ordered to resulted, or ordered to action. And all this data is in that database, so it's all available. You can extract it into BIS. You can use it in your turnaround times. So what we did here was I want to show you where it's ordered to action. So basically, the doctor orders a lab test. That starts the clock. And then the doctor orders a treatment for the patient's diagnosis based on the lab test result. And that's when you end the clock. And that's really what you want to optimize if you want to do value-based healthcare. So the example we used was troponin. And in patients that ended up having a non-ST elevation MI. So if the EKG is diagnostic and they have a STEMI, ST elevation MI, troponin plays no role in diagnostics. But in the case of non-ST elevation, the troponin is absolutely critical for making that diagnosis and initiating treatment in a timely manner. And what we looked at is we could see that from the doctor's order of the troponin until they ordered the medications that treat it, the dual antiplatelet therapy and the anticoagulation, normally should be within 2 hours. But there was a whole bunch of patients that were delayed many hours. And these patients are losing muscle in their heart. I mean, their post-heart attack function is going to be worse. They're losing their cardiac reserve. They're going to have, more likely have heart failure, congestive heart failure, more likely to have arrhythmias. This is a big deal for these patients that could, if they had acted on it right away, could have saved a lot of the muscle in their heart. And so we really wanted to focus on that. And so we did a lot of interventions, monitoring the real-time data, looking at, order to action turnaround times. And so we implemented critical values where basically if the first troponin is greater than 1, it's a critical value. And then we also have a delta criteria where if it's rising in the first few hours, that it'll trigger a diagnosis of NSTEMI. And what we'll do is we'll actually page the provider responsible for ordering the treatment. So we'll do direct paging. So the software that we have in the laboratory is doing a very complex analysis and identifying this is a patient who needs a doctor's attention. We page that doctor directly. The technologist's action screen, their outstanding list in Beaker, actually shows them the pager number to page. So we actually pull that data out. They page that doctor. The doctor evaluates the patient and orders the medications that treat the patient. So the objective is to provide the information directly to the provider responsible for making a timely clinical assessment. And then we're monitoring this ongoing. So we can see the dramatic improvement we're getting in diagnosing non-ST elevation MIs and getting the patient treated in a timely manner. And here's another good example where we're monitoring where the troponin was ordered at 7:08. They ordered now in 2 hours and 4 hours. But the nurse didn't print the label until 9:32. And once the label was printed, they collected it, sent it to the lab, and the result was done in 23 minutes. So the total turnaround time from order to result time was 2 hours and 50 minutes. We consider this 50 minutes delayed. But the delay is in the time from collection until label printed by the nurse. And of course, then we can use our informatics to figure out exactly what happened in this example, so we can troubleshoot it. So just in conclusion, the containers per patient and container transfers are a better key performance indicator for lab efficiency than test volume for an integrated health system. Data extraction queries must be validated using multiple data sources before they can be trusted to build insights or guide operational decisions. Real efficiency gains are best achieved through sustained systematic optimization of processes using best practice laboratory informatics. Written service level agreements are the foundation for quality KPIs. And portable optimized work cells with standalone analyzers promise maximum economies of scale in an expanding healthcare system. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Skelton. And we're going to open up the floor for a brief Q&A session. So if anybody has any questions, there's a couple of microphones at each side. So if there's any questions from the floor, please come up. While you're putting your questions together, maybe I'll start the Q&A session with a question for Dr. Jackson. I'm curious for you to elaborate a little bit. You mentioned around the importance of deriving patient-specific or patient quality metrics. What would be your recommendation for laboratories that want to start, that endeavor, and what would they want to do? What would be your recommendations on how to start tackling that issue?
Yeah, this one's still on. Well, I think this last example is a great one with the troponins. I think step one is clearly to collaborate with a clinical group because none of these outcomes are going to be achieved in the laboratory alone. It's always going to be a larger process. That troponin example, 3 hours sounds pretty bad. I remember a case in our own hospital of a 5-hour turnaround time, and because nursing didn't release the order, and so the lab didn't know that they were trying to order the test. It was a complete fiasco. But any of these outcomes are going to require collaboration.
Are there any questions from the floor yet? No? I'd like to ask a question to Dr. Skelton as well, while we wait for people from the audience to ask. Can you elaborate a little bit on what we may consider metric fatigue? So labs measure a lot of things, and everything that we measure has to provide value. So how do you prioritize or establish a cadence around what metrics you should measure when and how to demonstrate the value around those metrics?
Yeah, I mean, I think the key thing I'm looking for are examples where the laboratory has a big impact downstream. You know, I want to get hospital leadership to understand that the important financial impact of the laboratory is the effect it has on clinical practice. So we're particularly looking for metrics that demonstrate that, you know, that demonstrate value, that there's a win-win situation, it's costing the institution less money, and the patients are getting better care. You know, so those are the ones we're primarily focusing on. But then, of course, we get a lot of demands on us that we can best answer with metrics. You know, so a good example is the population health is really gearing up for the system now to score well on these metrics. You know, so in that example, we'll actually just take, you know, the HEDIS measure, you know, so whatever it is, you know, or the sepsis bundle, you know, or the HEDIS measure for diabetic patients, and we'll build into the informatics exactly what's on the metric, you know, so that we're measuring the same thing that we get scored on in terms of public reporting of, you know, Leahy got good quality, or doctors reporting, or, you know, and there's pay, you know, so the larger the financial payoff is of getting a good quality score, we'll prioritize those higher.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Okay, we have one question over here.
Good morning. Thanks for the presentation. It's very, very nice. Please, have you considered expanding the scope in the future to point of care, and does that not pose special challenges?
I would absolutely agree. Point of care is diagnostics, and so any measurement systems need to, you know, treat those as part of the mix. I don't think location, you know, should put something into a different sort of qualitative measurement category.
Great. I think we have one more.
Thank you very much for the presentations. I really enjoyed both of them. I have a question for Dr. Skelton. When you built your database, did you have in mind what metrics, what key performance indicators you wanted to measure at the time you were building your database?
Yeah, that's a great question, because in order to report on something, the data has to get in a discrete format. You know, so I think I got that concept at the beginning, but of course our key metrics keep changing, and we'll end up changing how we actually document things in the medical record if there's a need for a reporting outcome. You know, so I think you know, anatom pathology was great. You know, the anatom pathologists have all these just free text interpretations, which there's really no good tool to get the information out of that. You know, natural language processing doesn't work, you know. So I think often what I would do is say, okay, we need to build this with discrete data elements, just like the clinical lab, so that, you know, that you got 5 categories of cytology diagnosis. That needs to be a discrete element that the surgical pathologist or the cytologist enters in when they sign the report. But see, build is ongoing. So, you know, we weren't as smart as we are now when we went live. So I don't know that we 100% appreciated that, but I think now we're really appreciating that you really should start with what is the report you want at the end, then say, okay, how are we going to extract that report, and then make sure the data gets in a way that's valid. You know, make sure that, you know, if nurses are supposed to enter something, they're actually entering it, and they're entering it correctly, and that it's being captured in a discrete format that then you can extract and pull out. So I think that's an absolutely great question. I think you should really start with the report and then work your way backwards.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank everyone here for your attention. Before we go, I just want to remind you again, we have some evaluation forms on your desks. Please make sure you provide feedback to us. It is very valuable. I'd also like to remind you of the PACE and accent form information. You have it. It's over here as well if you need to take a note of that. Lastly, but not, last but not least, I want to invite you again to the other series of workshops that we'll have. They will all be held here in Grand Ballroom, and we'll have one again this evening on Six Sigma and quality metrics and quality control, where we're going to be revealing some of the data on the Alinity system as well. And also, I'd like to extend an invitation for you to visit the Abbott booth at the Clinical Expo. Is booth number 3916. I'm sure you won't be able to miss it once you walk the booth. Last, I'd like to thank our speakers, and I'd like to thank you for your attendance, and see you again in the afternoon. Thanks.